For 19 long years, he was just a shadow on the streets, a nameless, forgotten man, wrapped in tattered layers of old clothes, his face hidden behind an overgrown beard and dirt-smudged skin. People passed him by every day, businessmen in sharp suits, teenagers glued to their phones, mothers hurrying their children along, but no one ever stopped. No one ever asked his name. To them, he was just another homeless man, one of the many faces that blended into the city's background. He sat on the same street corner near the old coffee shop, huddled in a blanket that had long lost its warmth. The only sounds around him were the hum of traffic, the occasional jingle of a few coins dropped by a kind passerby, and the whispers, those quiet, judgmental murmurs that followed him wherever he went. Don't look at him. He's probably crazy. I bet he's a drunk. He's been here forever. Wonder why he never leaves. But then, one day, something changed. A sleek black SUV rolled up to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the dull gray sky. It stood out in this part of town, too polished, too expensive. The engine hummed softly as it idled, as if waiting for something or someone. People glanced at it, but quickly looked away, uninterested. To them, it was just another rich person's car, probably lost or making a quick stop. Then the back door slowly opened. A man in a tailored black coat stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He looked around briefly before his eyes locked onto the homeless man sitting on the sidewalk. Without hesitation, he walked straight toward him. People who had ignored the homeless man for years suddenly found themselves watching. The barista at the coffee shop, the old woman feeding pigeons, the office workers crossing the street, everyone turned their heads. Whispers started again, but this time, they were different. The man in the black coat bent down slightly, his voice low but clear. It's time. The homeless man lifted his head. His tired, sunken eyes met the other man's gaze, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, recognition flickered across his face. He didn't say a word. He just nodded. Then slowly, he reached for the outstretched hand in front of him. As he stood up, people gasped. They had never seen him move from that spot. It was as if he had been frozen in time until now. Without looking back, he followed the man in the coat and stepped into the SUV. The door shut. The engine revved, and just like that he was gone. No one knew who he was. No one knew where he had gone. But for the first time in 19 years, people were left wondering, who was this man? And why, after all this time, had someone finally come for him? Inside the black SUV, the air was thick with silence. The homeless man sat stiffly in the plush leather seat, his fingers gripping the worn-out fabric of his coat. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with the lingering smell of the streets clinging. To him, creating a strange contrast. He felt out of place, like he didn't belong here. The man in the black coat sat beside him, adjusting his cufflinks as if nothing unusual was happening. He didn't speak, didn't explain. He simply sat there, his sharp eyes fixed ahead. The driver, an older man with a stern face, glanced at them briefly in the rearview mirror before pressing a button on the dashboard. The window between them slowly rolled up, shutting them off from the front of the car. The homeless man shifted uncomfortably. Where are we going?" His voice was rough, as if unused for a long time. The man beside him turned slightly, his expression unreadable. Somewhere safe, safe. That word felt foreign to him. He had lived on the streets for so long that safety was just an illusion. He had learned that lesson the hard way. The SUV moved smoothly through the city streets, past people who had ignored him for years, past buildings he had only ever seen from the outside. The lights of the city flickered through the tinted windows, but in here, it was quiet, detached from the world outside. He glanced down at his hands, the dirt beneath his fingernails, the deep lines carved into his skin. He had been invisible for so long. Why now? Why had someone finally come for him? The silence stretched until he couldn't take it anymore. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quieter this time. The man in the black coat studied him for a moment before answering. "A friend." That word made him scoff. "I don't have friends." The man gave a small smile, but there was no warmth in it. Not anymore. That response sent a chill through him. There was something unsettling about the way he said it, like he knew things about him, things no stranger should know. The SUV made a sudden turn, leaving the main roads behind. The buildings became less familiar, the streetlights fewer and farther between. They were heading somewhere quieter, somewhere hidden. His heart started to beat faster. He had learned long ago that when someone like him was taken somewhere hidden, it usually wasn't for a good reason. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get out of this car while he still could. But where would he go? Back to the streets. Back to being ignored. The man in the black coat must have noticed his tension. "Relax," he said calmly. "If we meant you harm, we wouldn't have waited 19 years. 19 years. That number sent a jolt through him. He had lost track of time long ago, but hearing it spoken aloud reminded him of just how long he had been out here, how long he had been alone. He swallowed hard. "Then tell me what you want." The man's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something deeper. All in good time. The car continued down a narrow, dark road. There were no streetlights now, only the occasional glow of passing headlights in the distance. Then finally, the SUV slowed and turned into a gated driveway. The iron gates opened, smoothly, as if expecting them, and the vehicle pulled inside. The homeless man stared out the window. The building before them wasn't what he expected. It wasn't a mansion or a high-rise. It was a quiet, unmarked house, large but unassuming, tucked away from the city's noise. The car stopped. The driver stepped out first, walking around to open the door for them. The man in the black coat got out without hesitation, adjusting his sleeves as he turned back. "Come." The homeless man hesitated. His instincts still screamed at him to run. But something else, something deeper, kept him rooted to the seat. He wasn't sure if it was fear or curiosity. After a long moment, he took a breath and stepped out. The air was cold, carrying the scent of trees and damp earth. It felt different from the city, quieter, heavier. He followed the man toward the house, his steps slow, uncertain. The front door opened before they even reached it, revealing a dimly lit hallway beyond. As he stepped inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a strange sense of familiarity. It was faint, buried deep beneath years of loneliness and survival. But it was there. A feeling that he had been here before, that he knew this place, but that was impossible. Wasn't it? His pulse quickened as the door shut behind him. The walls seemed to close in, the weight of something unseen pressing down on him. He turned to the man in the black coat, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this place?" The man's gaze was steady. "Home." The word hit him like a punch to the chest. He opened his mouth to argue, to say that he had no home, that he hadn't had one in nearly 2 decades. But before he could speak, another voice cut through the silence. "It's been a long time." He turned sharply. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stepped forward. Another man, older, his face shadowed by the dim light. But even before he fully saw him, something inside him recognized that voice. And then, like a floodgate breaking open memories he had, long buried, started clawing their way back. Faces, voices, a past he had forced himself to forget. His breath caught in his throat. His vision blurred, and then, for the first time in 19 years, he remembered. His breath felt heavy in his chest as he stared at the older man standing in the dimly lit hallway. The voice, the posture, even the way the man tilted his head slightly, it all sent a wave of recognition through him, though he couldn't fully grasp why. The memories were like shadows, flickering just beyond his reach, teasing him with glimpses of something long forgotten. The older man took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "You don't remember me, do you?" The homeless man swallowed. Hard, his throat dry. He wanted to say no, but something deep inside him whispered that he did know this man. He just couldn't piece together how. The man in the black coat, who had been silent since they entered, finally spoke. "Give him time." His voice was calm, steady, but there was an edge to it, like he already knew how this would play out. The older man's eyes didn't leave him. "Time," he repeated, almost to himself. Then he gave a small, tired sigh. "We don't have much of that left." A strange chill ran down the homeless man's spine. "What do you mean?" The older man hesitated, then motioned toward a doorway down the hall. "Come inside. There's a lot you need to understand." Something inside him screamed not to follow. That same survival instinct that had kept him alive for years on the streets told him that whatever lay beyond that door was going to change everything. But at the same time, he couldn't turn back now. He had already stepped into something far bigger than himself. With cautious steps, he followed them into the room. It was warmer in here, the glow of a fireplace casting flickering light across dark wooden walls. The furniture was simple but elegant, the kind of place that felt lived in yet untouched at the same time. The older man gestured to a chair. "Sit." He hesitated, but eventually lowered himself into the chair. The man in the black coat remained standing near the door, his posture stiff, watchful. The older man sat across from him, studying him with an intensity that made him uneasy. "Your name," the man finally said, "is Daniel." The homeless man blinked. The name didn't sound completely foreign, but it didn't feel like his either. It was like hearing a song he had once known but had long since forgotten the lyrics to. "I don't." He shook his head. "I don't remember." The older man's gaze didn't waver. "You will." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room. Then, the older man spoke again. 19 years ago, you disappeared." The words made his stomach twist. Disappeared? His hands clenched involuntarily, his fingernails pressing into his palms. He had always assumed that his life on the streets had simply happened, a series of misfortunes, bad choices, or circumstances that had led him to being forgotten. But now, for the first time, he was being told something different. Someone had noticed when he was gone. Someone had been waiting for him to come back. What happened to me? His voice was barely above a whisper. The older man exhaled slowly, as if carrying the weight of an old burden. "You were taken." The room felt colder suddenly, despite the warmth of the fire. "Taken?" He frowned. "By who?" "The man in the black." Coat finally stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "By people who didn't want you to remember who you were." A sharp pain shot through his head, a sudden overwhelming pressure that made him squeeze his eyes shut. Flashes, a dark room. Voices, a sharp metallic scent in the air. A hand gripping his wrist, dragging him forward. And then nothing. His eyes snapped. Open, his breath uneven. I don't understand." The older man watched him carefully. "You will," he said again, his voice softer this time. "But first, you need to know the truth. All of it." Daniel, if that was really his name, felt like he was, teetering on the edge of something vast, something terrifying. He had spent nearly 2 decades believing that he was nothing more than a nameless face in the crowd. But now, these people, whoever they were telling him that he was someone worth taking, someone worth erasing. The thought made his pulse race. He swallowed hard, meeting the older man's gaze. "Tell me everything." The man nodded slowly, and then, with a deep breath, he began to speak. The older man leaned forward, his fingers interlocked, his eyes locked onto Daniel's. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. Daniel could hear the quiet crackling of the fire, but it did nothing to ease the chill creeping up his spine. "You weren't always on the streets," the older man began, his voice measured, careful. "That was never meant to be your life." Daniel's fingers twitched, a strange sense of unease settling in. Then what was? There was a pause, brief but loaded. Then finally the man spoke again. "You were taken from us," he said. 19 years ago, in the middle of the night. We searched for you. We never stopped searching." Daniel's heartbeat drummed against his ribs. "Who's we?" The man hesitated, his jaw tightening before he answered. "Your family." The word felt foreign, almost meaningless. Family. That was something other people had, something he had let go of a long time ago. Daniel shook his head. "No, that can't be right. I don't remember any of this. I don't even remember you." The older man didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked pained. "That's because they made you forget." A sharp, pulsing ache stabbed at the back of Daniel's head, like something buried deep inside him was fighting to come loose. Images flickered, flashes of a life that felt just out of reach. A woman's voice, soft and distant. Laughter. A child's hands reaching for something just beyond the light. And then darkness. His breathing became uneven. "Who are they?" The man in the black coat finally stepped forward, his voice calm, but edged with something darker. "The people who took you," he said. "The people who erased you." Daniel clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. "Why?" The older man exhaled, as if he had been waiting for that question. "Because you knew something," he said. "Something they didn't want the world to find out." Daniel stared at him, trying to process the words, but they felt like pieces of a puzzle he didn't have. "What did I know?" The older man exchanged a glance with the man in the black coat, a silent conversation passing between them. Then, finally, he answered. "You were a witness, Daniel, to something dangerous, something powerful, and instead of killing you, they did something worse." His voice dropped lower. "They made you disappear." Daniel's chest tightened. The thought of it made his stomach turn. He had spent years believing his life had unraveled because of bad luck, because of circumstances beyond his control. But now, the truth was staring him in the face. His life had been stolen from him. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "Why am I remembering now?" The older man's eyes darkened. "Because they're losing control," he said. "And because it's time." Daniel's pulse pounded. "Time for what?" The older man's expression turned grave. "Time for you to come back." A deep, uneasy silence settled over the room. Daniel swallowed hard. "I don't know who I am anymore," he admitted. "I don't know if I can even you can." The man in the black coat interrupted, his voice sharper now. "And you have to. Because they know you're remembering. And they won't let that happen." A cold wave of realization washed over Daniel. "They're coming for me, aren't they?" The older man gave a slow, solemn nod. "Yes." The tension in the room thickened. Daniel felt it creeping into his bones, the weight of something inevitable pressing down on him. He had spent years being invisible, unnoticed, forgotten. But now, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, someone saw him. Someone wanted him back, and someone else wanted him gone. The sound of tires crunching gravel outside made them all freeze. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The older man stood. The man in the black coat reached inside his jacket. Daniel's hands trembled as he turned toward the window, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. Outside, under the cover of darkness, another black SUV had pulled up to the house. And this time, whoever was inside wasn't here to take him back. They were here to silence him. The room felt like it had stopped breathing. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the dark SUV outside. The headlights cut through the night, casting long shadows against the house. Whoever was in that car wasn't here by accident. They had found him. The man in the black. Coat moved first, stepping toward the window with slow, measured movements. He barely glanced at Daniel before reaching into his coat and pulling out a sleek black device. A soft click. A red light blinked twice before going still. "They're blocking the signal," he murmured. "No calls in, no calls out." Daniel's stomach twisted. The realization sank in fast. Whoever was out there didn't just find him. They were ready for this. The older man turned to Daniel, his expression unreadable. "We don't have much time." The SUV's doors remained shut. No movement, no sound. It was the quiet before the storm, and Daniel could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. His hands clenched. "What do they want?" he whispered. The man in the black coat shot him a look. "To make sure you never remember anything else." Something inside Daniel snapped into place. He wasn't just a loose end, he was a threat. If what they had told him was true, then someone had gone through a lot of trouble to erase him from existence. And now, they were here to finish the job. Flicker of movement outside. Daniel's breath hitched. A figure stepped out of the SUV, tall and deliberate, their silhouette backlit by the headlights. Then another, and another. 3 in total. Dressed in dark clothing, their faces unreadable. In the night. But even from a distance, Daniel could feel it, the cold, calculated presence of people who had done this before. People who knew how to make someone disappear. The older man inhaled sharply. "They won't wait long." The words had barely left his mouth when a sudden, sharp sound shattered the silence. A loud crack. Daniel flinched. Not a gunshot, but something else. The lights flickered. Then, all at once, the house was swallowed by darkness. For a split second, there was nothing but silence. Then footsteps. Fast, controlled, coming straight for them. The man in the black coat didn't hesitate. "Move, now." Daniel's body reacted before his mind caught up. He stumbled back, heart slamming against his ribs, as the older man grabbed his wrist and pulled him toward the hallway. A loud bang echoed through the house, someone forcing their way inside. Daniel's mind raced. He didn't know this house, didn't know where to go. But the older man moved like he did. "This way," he whispered sharply, dragging Daniel toward a narrow door at the end of the hall. He pushed it open, revealing a staircase leading downward. A basement. Daniel hesitated for a second. The man in the black coat turned, eyes dark. "Go." There was no time to argue. No time to think. Daniel moved. The air in the basement was cold, thick with dust, and something else, something that made his skin prickle. The moment they were inside, the door shut behind them with a near-silent click. Darkness swallowed them whole for a few seconds. The only sound was Daniel's unsteady breathing. Then, above them, faint but clear footsteps. Slow, searching. They were inside the house. Daniel's chest tightened. His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then, just as he was about to speak, something shifted in the darkness. Not the older man. Not the man in the black coat. Something else. A soft click. A hidden door at the far end of the basement creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway. And in that instant, Daniel realized whoever was standing there had been waiting for him. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The dim light from the basement barely illuminated the figure standing in the hidden doorway, but something about their presence sent a shiver down his spine. His pulse pounded as the older man and the man in the black coat stiffened beside him. They hadn't expected this. The figure stepped forward, just enough for Daniel to make out their face. It was a woman, older than him but familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that rooted him to the spot. "You've been running for a long time, Daniel," she said softly. "But this is where it ends." The word sent a cold wave through him. His mind screamed at him to remember, to connect the pieces. But the memories were still a blur. He could feel something on the edge of his consciousness, just out of reach. The footsteps above them were growing louder. The intruders were searching the house, moving closer. But the woman didn't seem afraid. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting this moment. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, her eyes flickering, with something unreadable. Then she spoke. "I'm the reason you're still alive." Daniel's chest tightened. "What does that mean?" The woman glanced at the older man and the man in the black coat, then back at him. "There's no time to explain everything, but you were never meant to remember. They took you because you saw something, but they didn't kill you. They couldn't kill you." Daniel's stomach twisted. "Why not?" She took another step closer. "Because you're one of them." The room spun. His mind refused to process the words. "No," he shook his head. "That's not possible." But deep down, something inside him whispered that it was, that it had always been. "You weren't just a witness, Daniel," the woman continued, her voice urgent now. "You were part of it. You worked with them. And when you tried to stop what they were doing, they erased you." Daniel's breath came in sharp gasps. The flashes in his mind, the dark room, the metallic scent, the feeling of being dragged. They weren't just memories of him being taken. They were memories of betrayal. His own. The older man's face was grim. "They turned you into a ghost, made you forget everything. But they've always known you might remember. That's why they're here now, to make sure you don't." The sounds from upstairs changed. The careful searching had stopped. Now, the footsteps were moving with purpose. They knew where he was. The woman's eyes locked onto his. "You have one chance, Daniel. Come with me. I can get you out of here. But you have to trust me." Daniel's mind was a storm. Nothing made sense. But at the same time, everything did. The last 19 years had been a lie. He had been running from something he didn't even remember. And now, the people who had erased him were here to finish what they started. A loud bang from upstairs, a door being kicked open. They were out of time. The woman reached for his hand. "Daniel." For the first time he realized he had a choice. Stay and fight a battle he didn't understand, or leave, and maybe, just maybe, finally uncover the truth. His fingers twitched, and then he moved. Daniel's fingers closed around the woman's hand, and in that instant, everything changed. She pulled him toward the hidden door, moving with a certainty that told him she had planned for this moment. The older man and the man in the black coat followed close behind, their steps quick but silent. Upstairs, the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. The intruders were nearly upon them. The passage beyond the hidden door was narrow, carved into the foundation of the house. Cold air rushed past Daniel's face as they hurried down a set of uneven stone steps. His heart pounded, but not just from fear. Something deep inside him stirred, like an old instinct waking up. He wasn't just running anymore. He was choosing. The woman led them through the darkness, her grip firm on his wrist. "Almost there," she whispered. A distant crash echoed behind them. Daniel didn't look back, but he could feel it the moment. The intruders realized they were gone. The tunnel opened into a small underground chamber. A single metal door stood at the far end. The woman punched in a code on a small keypad, and with a soft hiss, the door unlocked. She pushed it open, revealing a narrow road, empty except for a waiting car. The engine was already running. The older man turned to Daniel, his expression unreadable. "This is your last chance," he said. "If you leave now, there's no coming back." Daniel's chest tightened. He had spent so long feeling lost, drifting through life with no direction, no identity, and now he was standing at the edge of something huge, something terrifying. He took a deep breath. "I want to know the truth." The woman nodded once, satisfied. "Then get in." They piled into the car. The man in the black coat took the driver's seat, speeding away before the door had even finished closing behind them. The road was dark, lined with nothing but trees. The house disappeared into the distance, but Daniel knew the people inside wouldn't give up that easily. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine. Daniel stared out the window, his mind racing. Finally, he turned to the woman. "Who were they?" She exhaled slowly. "People who operate in the shadows. People with power. They control more than you can imagine, and they don't leave loose ends." Daniel swallowed hard. "And I was one of them?" "You were," she confirmed. "Until you tried to stop them." A flicker of something passed through Daniel's mind. A memory, still blurry, but there. A conversation in a dimly lit room, raised voices, a warning, then darkness. He had known something dangerous, and when he tried to expose it, they made sure he never would. The older man spoke up, his voice quiet. "You weren't supposed to survive, but someone on the inside protected you, wiped your mind instead of killing you. Gave you a chance to disappear." Daniel turned back to the woman. "Was it you?" She hesitated, then nodded, his stomach twisted. "Why?" Her gaze softened. "Because I knew who you really were, not the person they erased, you." Daniel looked away, his thoughts tangled. He had spent years thinking he was no one, a forgotten man on the streets. But now, he knew the truth. He had been someone important, someone dangerous. And the people who had tried to erase him weren't done yet. The car slowed as they approached a turnoff. The woman looked at Daniel carefully. "We have a safe house. You can stay there until we figure out our next move." Daniel considered her words. For so long he had wanted answers. Now he had them, but with those answers came a choice. He could keep running, hiding from the past that had already stolen so much from him. Or he could fight. He clenched his fists. He had lost 19 years. He wasn't going to lose anymore. He met the woman's gaze. "No more hiding. I want to finish what I started." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then we start tonight." The car disappeared down the road, vanishing into the darkness. Somewhere behind them, the people who had erased him were regrouping, planning their next move. But this time, Daniel wasn't just a target. He was coming back.